I'll always remember when Bob Iger went to Africa for the first time. And, I'm pretty sure when Bob goes to Africa, he has a pretty special experience. And so he saw a lot of the work we were doing. And he called me when he got back and said, "Oh my God, I knew we were doing great things, but when you see it, it's like, I am so proud." And so that kind of thing it's kind of cool.
That is Dr. Jackie Ogden, and you're listening to the Tomorrow Society podcast. Hey there, thanks so much for joining me here on episode 212 of the Tomorrow Society podcast. I am your host, Dan Heaton. Really excited about this show where I talked with Dr. Jackie Ogden, who worked for more than 30 years in leadership roles in the zoological world, including 19 years with the Walt Disney Company, where she was the vice president of animal science and environment for Walt Disney Parks and Resorts. Also was very closely involved in Disney's Animal Kingdom. She joined Disney less than a year before the opening of that park, led teams at Conservation Station, and then her role expanded to cover efforts Disney was making around the world, plus at the Seas Pavilion and, of course, at the Animal Kingdom in Walt Disney World. And we dive into her career at Disney, a lot of the efforts in that park, some of the challenges with something like Kilimanjaro Safaris, where you want to make sure you have top-notch animal care, but also it's a theme park with guests and entertainment, and how does all that come together? Then we talk about a lot of the cool conservation efforts that Disney's doing, like you heard in the intro, work that Jackie's done on environmental sustainability, and just some of the things that interest her about what's currently happening in the world of animal care with zoos and aquariums and a lot more. So let's dive right into it. Here is Jackie Ogden. Jackie, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast.
It's great to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Oh, totally. You were involved in so many interesting things, and I really like talking about the Animal Kingdom, especially with it being 25 years now that it's been open. It just seems like the right time. But I'd love to even go further back with you and just, what got you interested in ultimately moving to a career where you were focusing on the animal world and zoos and everything related to that?
I was lucky enough to grow up in San Diego, California, until I was 13 years old. And when I lived there, my parents sent me to basically, I think, every education program that the San Diego Zoo had. And I fell in love with animals. Also really realized I really liked zoos. Obviously, and thought, gosh, I think I could see myself in this sort of a place. I also spent a lot of time in canyons behind my house, a lot of times in natural spaces in general. We went camping in Yosemite every summer, those sorts of things too. So I think I was destined to go in that direction. But I got really bad advice when I was in high school, which was sort of the standard thing that people tell kids, which is if you want to work with animals, you have to be a veterinarian, especially if you want to make a living working with animals. And it's completely not true, but they just don't know. And so they say what they know. And so I volunteered with a local vet and went, this is not for me. I am, I really love seeing really healthy animals. I'm a little too emotional to work with sick animals. You should see me when my dog is not sick or is sick. So I ended up going a different direction and studied industrial organizational psychology because I am one of the weird animal people that also likes people. And so I said, well, okay, then I've always been curious about people too. So I'll study them and then I'll work with them.
So that raises a really good question of if you went in that direction and then ultimately still used your psychology background, but ultimately kind of switched gears, I know, went back to school and then focused more on animal behavior. So what made you decide to ultimately make that change?
Well, I was really old when I decided to change careers. I was 26, and it was really, it's so funny saying that. I thought I was way too old
Yeah.
to change careers. It's like, gosh, I'm on track, and I was actually making decent money, and I had a real job, and my parents were so happy that I was making decent money and having a real job. And I have had but I also realized that I was spending all of my free time volunteering for animal and conservation organizations. And so, at the age of 26, I went, okay, there's got to be a way I can make money doing this. And so I started looking into it. I still thought it was a little late to try, but then one of my very dear friends that I was dear friends with at the time was sort of elderly. She was 36. And she was just in the middle of leaving a really great job. She ran the MS Society in Seattle, Washington, to go back to school to be a clinical psychologist because that's what she had always wanted to do. And I went, oh my God, if somebody that old can do this, then surely I can. And so I decided to do it. And this is something I actually recommend to people a lot. I tried out a bunch of different things as a volunteer, as much as you sort of can do some of these things as a volunteer, and got a real feel for what sorts of things I wanted to do and like to do. And I've always wanted to go to graduate school anyhow. And so I decided to go that route. And my goal was to go to graduate school, focusing on animal behavior and research because I really love research because I'm very curious about behavior in general, whether it's people or human or non-human animals. But I really wanted to come out of graduate school not moving into academia, but actually in a leadership role within the zoo and aquarium and conservation worlds. So I did. So I went to graduate school at Georgia Tech in Atlanta, and I went there because my major professor, Dr. Terry Maple, was also the head of Zoo Atlanta at that time. So I was able to do my research there, which was really, really great fun.
Well, I'm curious just to ask you too, having to do with the psychology background, because I don't, not someone who works in the world, thinking in terms of, well, psychology actually fits really well with animal behavior. So I'd love to know a little bit just about how you kind of merge the two, where you focused on animals, but also still used your psychology background.
So I think that psychology is a great field to focus on. I think it really grounds you in behavior. It grounds you in cognitive functioning, whether you're dealing with humans or not. And so I've always been interested in behavior. I mean, I could watch people for hours. I love going to airports. I always love going early and having layovers. I'm like one of the only people that likes that because I know there will be great things to watch. And of course, I love animals and watching animal behavior. So, when I've had the incredible opportunity to go to Africa a number of times, and when I'm with a group of people that aren't necessarily animal people, I have to really be careful to not overwhelm them with how long I want to stay and watch a carmine bee eater because they really don't. And so I have to be sensitive to that. Yes, I know we're leaving after 20 minutes and that's really okay, Jackie. So I just love watching behavior. And it is interesting. I often had people, when I was a Disney executive, I often had my peers in other areas say, so does this psychology, animal behavior background help you at all in your field and in your job now? And I went, oh yeah, completely, because it really is all primate behavior. And so, this, especially since I studied apes, and apes are, we're a lot like apes. Apes are a lot like us. And so when I would get frustrated in meetings, I would just start thinking about the behavior and, thinking about what particular behaviors they were displaying and what it meant. And that was always entertaining.
Well, I know that you ultimately, after school or possibly connected to that, went and worked at the San Diego Zoo before joining Disney. So I'd love to know a little bit about that because San Diego Zoo, as one of the premier zoos around the world still is, and at that time especially seemed to just really stand out. So would love to hear a little bit about what you did there and how that ultimately led you on the path kind of to where you ended up at Disney.
Having grown up in San Diego, I always wanted to work at the San Diego Zoo. And I don't know if you've ever done the exercise of writing your own obituary.
No,
It's a great way to get to have student age, people sort of get a feel for actually what they want their life to be like, because it's as if you were writing your life story. And often things come out of it that you don't necessarily realize you're driven towards. And in my obituary, I was the head of human resources because I was studying industrial organizational psychology at the time. I was the head of human resources at the San Diego Zoo. So I always had wanted to work there. And so when I was at Georgia Tech, I was planning on doing my research at the zoo on cognitive functioning, cognitive behaviors in primates. And one day, Terry Maple, my major professor, who was great and always provided me with incredible opportunities, and still does, he called me and said, so if you had the opportunity to change your dissertation, do something entirely different, but go to San Diego and be able to do your dissertation there while you're answering a quite different question that they have and actually get paid for that experience, would you be interested? And I went, well, yeah, of course I would. But I also was just about a year into my first really, really serious relationship. And we were very committed to each other. And I had learned that you don't just make these decisions. You go home and you talk about it. So I said, I need to talk to him. But yes. And Terry said, well, there is this downside. You have to be there in 3 weeks. Oh, okay. So bottom line is I did go. So I went into the research department, the behavioral research department, which was part of what was then called the Center for Reproduction of Endangered Species, as a pre-doctoral fellow. And the zoo was really interested in having questions answered about their new gorilla tropics exhibit, which was beautiful, is beautiful. And they were interested in it primarily, really, actually, from the guest perspective and what guests were taking away from the experience. So that was the first time I really started doing a lot of guest research, which was really, really fun. So I stayed in in Crest for 3 years, 2 years in a postdoc position, and then had the opportunity to move into the children's zoo as the curator there, which was my first opportunity leading a large team. And I'd really just led interns and volunteers before. So the zoo really took a chance on me because I was going, really, I don't think I can do this, but okay. And it was just a great experience. I learned a ton about leadership. They were a great group of people. Really, I think areas that focus on kids just naturally, sort of by definition, focus so well on programming that, and interpretation, because you kind of have to. And so it was really great fun. And I loved being there. And I really sort of saw myself retiring from the San Diego Zoo. And because by that point, I was 31. So clearly close to retirement. But I really did see myself staying there. My husband and I loved San Diego. We just bought a house, all of that. And one thing you probably know is the zoo and aquarium world is really small. Everybody knows everybody. And because Terry was so good at providing me with opportunities in graduate school, I'd started presenting at conferences and publishing really early. And so I just knew a bunch of people already. And in fact, one of my dear friends I had worked with at Zoo Atlanta, and she was one of the first animal people Disney hired. So when she moved, I said, just don't call me about a job. I'm happy. I'm really glad you're there, but I don't need to go. Just let me be. And she behaved herself for a couple of years. And then she finally called and said, we just can't find somebody for this job that is curator of Conservation Station. And it's in some ways not dissimilar from what you're doing. And we just keep talking about you. Would you consider coming out? And it's like, oh. And so I dutifully went home and talked to my then now husband about this opportunity. And he looked pained, like I kind of was, but said, well, you kind of have to try, don't you? Go see it at least. It's like, yeah, I guess I do. And once you see something like that, and once you see this giant park that is coming up from where there used to be orange groves and now it's just sand, it was like, wow, this is pretty darn cool. And then I knew they were putting together a great animal team from all over, mostly AZA institutions, really incredible. And I knew many of them, and I knew that they were really talented. I knew that because I knew something about the Disney company, I knew that it was a very ethically focused company. So I knew they would do the right stuff for animals. I knew they were very focused on inspiring people to conservation action, which is one of the things that gets me up in the morning. And I also knew from the people I had met when I was out there that there were some really great leaders there, not just within the animal team, but more broadly, and that they would be great role models. So I decided to go.
Well, wow. So that covers so much just of what I was going to ask next, which is great. So what were some of your initial impressions of Disney's Animal Kingdom, particularly of Joe Rohde, who had led the design side of it from Imagineering for such a long time, even prior to when you arrived and then the park opened?
Disney's Animal Kingdom is a really unusual park. So it is absolutely a great zoo. It is accredited by the Association of Zoos and Aquariums. It does everything that a great zoo should do. It also is a full-fledged Disney theme park. And so that means it has world-class entertainment. It has great dining opportunities. It has, of course, Disney characters. It has all of the things that make a Disney park a Disney park. And the person that really deserves credit for that is Joe Rohde. And Joe was led the design of Disney's Animal Kingdom and then stayed with it for probably 15, 20 years. He just retired, I think, from the company. And Joe really deserves credit for first diving into this project with, I think, a passion for the environment, but without, he had never designed an animal-based theme park before. And he did. He did an amazing job. So it is the park that I think has the highest integrity of how you link the attractions, the storyline, the experiences, the animal piece, and the Disney piece all into one. And so as a result, the rides all have a real conservation message. And in fact, Expedition Everest, when it opened, not only has a great conservation message, but there's significant funding associated with its opening that went to Conservation International and others to do conservation work in Nepal and China. So it's really serious. And Joe deserves a ton of credit for making that all happen and also working incredibly hard. And I know it took a lot of incredibly hard work to ensure that the product continued to have that integrity. And it's why it's such a great place and why it's so wonderful. And it's why we all love it. So, and Joe is quite a character, as you may know, and is brilliant as well.
So you ultimately make the decision. You're like, okay, I'm going to do this. What was it like then to, well, one, you're moving across the country, I assume, but then ultimately to join them for a project, like you said, it's so big, and you joined pretty, not that long before it opened. So how chaotic and crazy and just interesting was that?
All of those things. It was amazing and it was challenging. It was so cool to be there as it emerged. Was all the things that you would think it would be. You're putting together a team of people that are coming from over 50 different ACA institutions, which is pretty incredible, and that don't necessarily know each other. And then you're trying to integrate them into the Disney culture, which is really different than a zoo and aquarium culture. And you're trying to also educate the Disney people what you do and what it's like to be in the animal world and the things they now need to think about. And so it was really, really great fun. It was chaotic. You're right. I joined late because they had trouble filling the role. And I did not think until a couple of years later that I actually was only there for 8 months before we opened. It was never useful for me to think about that at the time. So it's because I had way too much to do. And it's also creating systems, processes, bringing your animal family together too, a lot of stuff.
Well, yeah, I mean, there aren't that many brand new, I know this is a little different because it's like a theme park and a zoo, but brand new zoos that appear in the United States or in North America. So how much was involved with that, where you have this entirely, like you said, from the ground up park where habitats are being created and like Conservation Station, but then, as an attraction, but all these other places, and it's not building on something that already exists.
So it's fascinating. It is challenging. It's weird for most, well, really for all of us. The design part was kind of done when we all started. There were certainly tweaks that could be made. When I started, there really wasn't even a lot of time to tweak. Things were really at that point, any tweak was a was scope creep, and nobody likes that. So many of us were given sort of the spaces that we didn't really have a lot of control over, and so that's always hard, right? But in large measure, they were great designs, and so it was a matter of then figure out, okay, how are you going to use this design? And this space was actually made for golden light tamarins, but probably not the best place for golden light tamarins. So what else do we do instead? Those sorts of things. Then, of course, bringing in all of the animals from mostly AZA organizations. Then really, as you're working with the animals, getting them accustomed to being there, socializing them, starting the training programs, all the programmatic work of, how, and because my role was bridged both the animal side and the education side a lot, I worked with the education team a lot on what messages were we going to get across, what animal demonstrations were we going to do, how were we going to integrate our conservation stories, all of that stuff. So it was just fascinating and complicated.
I can imagine. Well, also too, I'm curious to know a little bit about, I know you mentioned the design was in place, but you're coming into something where you have experience with the San Diego Zoo, which again, kind of has themed entertainment elements and always has, but then it's a theme park where Disney still has guests that are coming in expecting a Disney park, but then it's also somewhere where you want to give top-notch animal care. So was there a push? Again, not a push and pull, meaning there's anything a sacrifice, but I'm curious about that kind of mix when you're working there.
So that's a great question, and absolutely is something that the entire zoo and aquarium world was very curious about. And as you said, San Diego, also has some highly themed areas, although the Imagineers don't love that term. And every zoo or aquarium really has goals. They have both entertaining people as well and recreation, as well as educating them and inspiring them to conservation action. So everybody does that to some degree or other. Disney's just probably on the end of the spectrum in terms of how they do it. And I think what helped was that conservation was so woven into the theme of the park, even though the rides had conservation messages woven in. Now, does everybody that rides Cali River Rapids really understand that it is about deforestation? No, they don't. Probably, but some folks do get it. But I think for the people that worked there, the animal folks, that was really helpful to know that the designers cared that much, that Disney cared that much about the conservation piece, that they even integrated messages into the ride. And there's a huge focus on integrating conservation into everything. When we opened the Mickey bars, actually the little the wood stick actually had conservation messages on it. Gave them a lot of training about what it means to be an animal park and what it means to be an accredited zoo, and why we care about conservation, what Disney was already doing for conservation, those sorts of things. So it was interesting. So I mentioned that the AZA World Association of Zoos and Aquariums, the accrediting body for probably the best accrediting body in the world for its 230 some members. So everybody within that group was watching all of this very closely, and particularly people that didn't know Disney as a company, which honestly, other than the wide world of Disney on Sunday nights, probably most of our folks really weren't, they certainly weren't Disney files. They might have gone to the park a few times, but they didn't know a ton about the company. And so it was pretty easy to think that Disney was going to do what I fondly refer to as stupid animal stuff. That there would be chimps riding on bicycles, bears on unicycles, all of that stuff. And if you knew something about the company and knew how what their code of ethics is, you would know that was never going to happen. but there was that assumption. So there were just a lot of myths. One was about the chimps riding on bicycles. Another was that as soon as things get tight, the conservation support is going to go away. All of those sorts of things. And so it took time to demonstrate that none of those things were true. And so those of us that were there, we talked a lot to all of our colleagues, and we took a lot of razzing. But one of the great things is that the Disney gang generally has a great sense of humor. The company as a whole, certainly within parks and resorts, and certainly within Walt Disney World, and definitely at Disney's Animal Kingdom. And so, and they generally don't love ego when they're hiring people. So there were a whole bunch of people at Disney's Animal Kingdom within the zoo and aquarium world that didn't have a lot of ego and had a good sense of humor and were able to laugh at themselves. And so we spent a lot of time laughing along with people to their jokes, cringing inside, and then taking an opportunity to tell them what it really was. And so we did that a lot. We gave a lot of presentations at conferences on what we were doing. And we also did a huge thing, which is we shared a lot of information. That is, of course, what any accredited zoo and aquarium would do, but everybody assumed Disney would not do that. And we did. We openly share policies. This is still true. Openly share policies, openly share SOGs, those sorts of things. And of course, getting legal to understand why that was critical was hard. But we did. And so that helped a lot. And I think just the fact that we knew so many people and those people did trust us to some degree, to not have gone someplace that was stupid. And so I think they also felt a measure of comfort. Well, oh, if you guys are there, then it must really be okay. And then we went through the first, economic stuff and didn't cut the conservation programs. And that was, those sorts of things. And that was hugely helpful.
Well, yeah, because, there was a downturn with travel and a few years after it opened. So that the fact that it hung in there. I think this is a good time to ask you about the Disney Conservation Fund and about some of the efforts there, because as I learn more about that through a few other interviews and then also through what I've read, I'm impressed just by how much is done, because you can go to the park and you'll see info and stuff, but as you dig in more, there's just so much there. So I'd love to know, you've referenced it a few times, but about that Disney Conservation Fund, and what impact it's made and kind of your experiences.
I mentioned that one of the reasons I went there was that I was sure that Disney would do a lot for conservation. And that has absolutely been true. And in fact, it grows. The company was very smart and put together a group of experts from the zoological world, but also the animal welfare world. And they became the Disney Animal Kingdom Advisory Board. They were very instrumental in helping the company understand what all of this meant. And one of the key lessons that they provided was you have to do conservation work. You have to support conservation. And it cannot just be an afterthought. You can't just, put something, put a, what do they say? Put a lipstick on a pig. You can't put lipstick on a pig and think that you really have people really believe that you're serious about this. And so that led to the development of the Disney Conservation Fund. It was in the Disney Wildlife Conservation Fund. And a great woman and friend, Kim Sams, who was within the public affairs team, was the one that really guided it along. She just retired maybe this last year. And so she was really instrumental in bringing all of that to life. And of course, our team worked really closely with them. So the Disney Conservation Fund, which initially was called the Disney Wildlife Conservation Fund, started in about 1996, so before the park even opened. And since that time, it has provided more than $125 million to conservation organizations around the world, about 25 of them, and including 400 different conservation grants that have helped more than 200 species. And, of course, it's not just the species that are important, it's the habitat, and certainly that's a focus. So the Conservation Fund has done just incredible things. They've provided huge support to the Association of Zoos and Aquariums. For many years, there was a separate, I guess there still is, a separate pot of money that Disney would give to the AZA to use as part of their conservation granting, the AZA's conservation granting program, in addition to the funds that they already had. And so huge impact that way as well. And then when I was there, I think believing that we would just be a granting organization, that we wouldn't do a ton of our own conservation work. But over time, it became clear that that was not the smartest way to do this. That, again, when you're trying to really make a difference for conservation, it's one thing just to write checks, but you have to really do the work. And especially if you want to tell stories to people about what's going on in conservation, it's a lot more meaningful if you yourself or your teammates have been involved in monitoring sea turtles on the east coast of Florida and then watching the babies, if you will, sorry, not very scientific, emerge and go into the water. And that's a whole lot more meaningful of a story and we wrote a check to the sea turtle people. And so we started doing more and more of that work ourselves, and that's really grown. And so one of the things I heard recently is that we've recorded the 1.5 millionth sea turtle hatching, and we've counted over 20,000 nests on the eastern coast of Florida, primarily around where the Disney's Vero Beach Resort is. And they're involved with a whole bunch of other work, whether it is work with butterflies, whether it's work with gorillas, whether it is working with birds that are found on the Walt Disney World property, including purple martins, really cute little songbird that is sadly really in decline because their habitat is going away. Their homes are going away. The team has put up over 400 different nests across Walt Disney World, and they're monitoring it, which also means they can have cast members from other areas be part of the monitoring so that everybody begins to realize that this is really, not just the conservation team's work, but it's our work, and everybody supports the conservation mission. So they've done incredible things in that way.
Wow, that's really impressive just to kind of hear those numbers in terms of the sea turtles and everyone else. I think this leads well back into kind of circling backwards to when you started at Conservation Station as a curator. So I would love to know a little bit about your work there, because, that's a really interesting place. Just I've been there, and then they're sometimes performing an operation, and then there's just a lot of interesting elements of that place from the start and continues to be that way today.
So I love Conservation Station, and it was great fun to help bring it to life. It's a really interesting part of the park. It's the part of the park where really all of the stories come together to really talk about what Disney is doing to help animals and habitats around the world, and really what's involved with all of that. There's also challenges with Conservation Station in that, as you probably know, it's a little hard to get to.
Yeah.
And what that means in a Disney park is if you have to go a long ways to get, well, really anywhere, if you have to go a long ways to get to something, you really want to pay off for that. I'm old enough, I don't know if you are, to remember Disney's when we graded the rides by letters. So an e-ticket ride was the Matterhorn at Disneyland. It would be the Safari or Everest at Animal Kingdom. And so if you go that far, if you walk that far to get to an attraction, in this case, Conservation Station, you really think you're going to get an e-ticket experience. It was never designed to be an e-ticket experience. It is really it's got incredibly cool things in it and fun things to do, but people have to do them, and sometimes people are less willing to do so. So that's a shame, because it really does it. It is the most interpretive part of the park, both in terms of especially what Disney is doing for animals and conservation, including the parts where you actually look into how it is that we care for animals, from a research perspective, a science perspective, to a veterinary perspective, to a nutrition perspective. And so being able to give windows into those things, and also to show, we're proud of what we do. You can see our veterinary care right here. That is really great. And one of the things that's really fun now is the number of zoos and aquariums that have now created an opportunity for, as they're building new veterinary areas, for people to see into those. So I'm pretty sure vets around the world are really annoyed with Disney. So as they don't all love being on show, as we say.
Yeah, I'm sure they're like, we were doing just fine. But for me as a guest, I think it's something that you're like, if you go by that window and something is happening, it's like, wow, this is like something really special. But you're right, you do have to take the train and then walk. It almost feels like you're discovering something because it's so far away, but not everyone wants to have to do that. So,
It's just it's an ongoing challenge. I'm sure that I think there are always people in the background at Disney that are thinking, so how could we change this in some way? So I suspect it will, something will change over time, but it'll be interesting to see what that is.
Yeah, well, you referenced the safari, Kilimanjaro safaris, and then earlier you referenced Kelly River Rapids. Overall, I mean, especially with the safari, what always kind of interests me is just how complicated it was to have it where you're riding past all these animals, and then you can't see the fact that we can see them so closely, but it's hard to realize that they're blocked in a way, or there's things put in place. But I know you came in kind of late in the game, but I'm curious just from what you saw, just like how complicated it was, or how can you put in systems like that where it can be effective, where guests can see the animals really well, but then it's also makes sense for all those different type of species and everything else.
So it's hard.
Yes.
It really is. You use the right term. It's really complicated. It is arguably I believe, still the best animal experience as a whole, in a zoological park or a theme park in the world. And it's because of its nature. So it is over 100 acres. You're, of course, supposed to be in Africa. That was how it was designed. There are a couple places in particular that they drew upon. And when you go to those places in Africa, you go, oh my God, it really does look like the safari ride. It's amazing. How incredibly accurate the experience of being on the safari is, aside from the fact that there are lots of other safari vehicles. But I just realized I was just in Kenya and Tanzania this past year. There are a lot of safari vehicles there too, so maybe that's not so different. But so those animals, as you said, they need to have a place to go at night. They have bedrooms, just like we do. And some of them stay out, but most of them go into bedrooms. And that's because you have to if you want that area to keep looking like not Africa in a severe drought, then it means you have to take care of it. You've got to do maintenance. You've got to do horticulture work and irrigation work, whatever it might be, road work. And so that means that most of the animals really can't be out at that time. And also we need to look at the animals. And so the animals we need to be able to have the animals come inside if they need to for treatment or because there's an emergency or whatever. And so that means that every animal that is on the safari has to be trained to go in and out every day and at will, right? You don't time an emergency. So if there's an emergency, they have to come in, whether even at the wrong time of the day. So that is incredibly complicated. And it's not inexpensive, as you might guess. A lot of people involved in making that occur, and that all work. We always call those things at Disney the daily miracle, right? That it just all comes together. So it's even more complicated by the fact that it is such a mixed species exhibit, and that it is run by both animal people and operators. And operators are not used to dealing with live animals, except for people. The jungle cruise maybe arguably is a little different, except for those animals actually aren't alive. Sorry.
What?
I know. I hate to spoil the magic. And so, as you can imagine, early on and to this day, there's a constant focus on training the non-animal people training the drivers that also aren't animal people, both in the messaging and the spiel. There's, of course, a spiel, but they have to understand a bit more about it so they understand sort of why the spiel is the way it is. And then they also have to really understand not only how to drive those vehicles, which is not easy in and of itself, but how to do it when there are actually animals there. And so that was really hard at the beginning, and it continues to be hard today. It's just complicated, but it is, the end result is phenomenal.
Yeah, I almost feel like the behind the scenes is even more interesting than the ride, doing the ride itself, which is also great. So it's both ends of it. Well, I want to focus to expand a little bit to your role as it expanded, but I'd love to just ask one more question about Animal Kingdom from your perspective. I mean, what's an aspect or part of your work on the Animal Kingdom that you look back and you're like, wow, that's something that I'm proud of, or something that was a good accomplishment?
Great question. I think probably two things. One is I was part of really building what I considered to be a healthy culture, organizational culture. I care deeply about cultures and know that, really it is the leadership ultimately that creates that culture. So, and I really felt like I created that. My team worked closely together. They were open with each other about what resources they had. They shared resources. It's like nobody does that. And so that was one piece. I think the other piece was working to have our cast members, because of course Disney does call them cast members, our cast members be actively involved in field conservation. So we weren't just writing checks, and so having it doing that, but also having the company not only accept that we were doing it, but be proud of the fact that we were doing it. That was huge. And so I'll always remember when Bob Iger went to Africa for the first time. And, I'm pretty sure when Bob goes to Africa, he has a pretty special experience. And so he saw a lot of the work we were doing. And he called me when he got back and said, "Oh my God, I knew we were doing great things, but when you see it, it's like, I am so proud." And so that kind of thing it's kind of cool.
Oh yeah. Yeah. To get any calls from Bob Iger, but with that kind of message, that's pretty awesome. Well, I know your role did expand where you were going beyond Disney Animal Kingdom, and then you were kind of working with efforts across all parks and resorts. So I'm curious to learn a little bit about how your role changed and kind of some of the things you were doing as you moved further in your career at Disney.
So at Walt Disney World, there is the operating teams at all of the parks in all the areas. But then there also is a group that is called the Line of Business Organization, or at least that's what it was called. I'm sure it's changed names now. But in that Line of Business organizations included leaders from food and beverage, from merchandise, from operations, from animal science and environment. And a number of others, entertainment and so on. So we were responsible for working with all of the operations to ensure that people were following the same standards, that we had consistent standards, that we knew how to make their lives easier from an operational perspective, that sort of thing. And I was the only person on that team that led not only the line of business piece, but also the operational piece, because they realized animals were a bit different, and that it was going to make sense to do that. So at one point, the line of business organization shifted from being just at Walt Disney World to around the world. And so all of a sudden, the line of business organization served all of the theme parks, whether it was in Hong Kong or whether it was in California and Paris and Florida, et cetera. And I think that's changed now. I think it's gone back a bit the other direction. Pendulums always swing back and forth. But that's how that shift, the animal part of that shift, was made. From a parks and resorts perspective, what really changed within my role over time, first at Walt Disney World and then across parks and resorts, is the company got really serious about the environment and about environmental sustainability. And we'd always had a focus on it. I mean, Walt was very passionate about animals and conservation. And so there were green teams everywhere. And there was a tiny little group of people that did an amazing job helping to support these gazillions of green teams that were everywhere. But it was really a grassroots operation. And all of a sudden, Bob said, if we're going to be the most admired company in the world, we'd better be serious about what we do from an environmental perspective. And the environmental world was starting, I think people are starting to realize how incredibly complicated it is and that there's no easy answer. And you really have to do a lot of work to figure out what the right thing is to do. And it varies. The right thing to do varies between where I now live, which is Bellingham, Washington, to really different when you were talking about Hong Kong or Shanghai. And so complicated. So they decided to put in a person within Walt Disney World that was at a higher level to focus on the environment. So I then had that added to my scope. And then when we went global, that scope went global. And so each park had a small group of people that were focused on it. I mean, these are really pretty small teams. They do an incredible amount of work, and they're amazing people. So small groups that did that work, but then I was responsible really kind of at some level for making sure that they did do the environmental work that we were supposed to. And when the company got serious about that, about the environment, they also put in place, and Dr. Beth Stevens, who had been running Disney's Animal Kingdom, then moved into leading that for the company. And so she led the effort to develop company-wide environmental goals and company-wide targets. And because of the fact that Walt Disney World alone is a huge part of the footprint, and then Walt Disney Parks and Resorts is a giant part of the footprint, I also helped develop the company-wide targets because we were so much of a part of that, such a big part of that footprint. And so that's really kind of how that changed and how my role became global. And it was great fun. It was the environmental work was fascinating and hard and complicated because inarguably, the operational leaders within parks and resorts have a lot of priorities. And they may love the planet and they may love the environment and they may love animals, but they have a bunch of other things that they really have to love more. And not all of them really are huge lovers of animals. And that's probably maybe not going to change. And so, getting them to focus on this work and do this work, it was really all about making it as easy as we possibly could. And also really showing them demonstrating over and over again what the business case was for doing this work. And then also what metrics we were looking at to help them do this work, understand how they were doing, getting reports on it, yada, 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 all that stuff.
It sounds like a very big job. That's what I will say, especially given just sustainability for like Walt Disney World, like you mentioned. I know they added that very large renewable energy, solar panels that they've been adding, but I'm sure there's so many efforts like that in every corner of the resort. I want to ask you about one particular corner, a little bit more relating to that, because I know that the Seas Pavilion is kind of the other, the other big. When you think about areas that have a lot of animal care or animal behavior in Walt Disney World, that's the other big one. And going back to the late 80s, I remember going there as a kid when it first opened in 1986. That was like, whoa, this is something. But I'd love to know a little bit. I know that you were in charge of a lot of things, but just from your perspective, what kind of stands out to you from that pavilion, or just maybe even challenges about how to keep it running well?
So I love what was then the Living Seas and is now the Seas with Nemo and Friends. And so when that was added to my portfolio, it was like, oh my God, this is so exciting. And oh dear, I know nothing about the aquatic world. And I quickly learned that the aquatic world is inarguably more complicated than the terrestrial world. And certainly it was very clear I do very little. So the really great thing was that there was and is an amazing team at the Seas that helped educate me. And I really began to understand how the different elements that made all of that work. And, like one that people really know very little about is the life support team. And what they do is they ensure that the environment is safe for the animals, is right for the animals, is what it needs to be. And at the seas, they make their own salt water. So there is an incredibly complex process to get that recipe, if you will, right. These aren't folks that just, turn screws or fix pumps. These are experts in chemistry. And so I remember attending meetings and seeing all of the calculations up on a board, kind of as if you were in NASA, and knowing that they were using calculus and that there was a small part of my brain that should remember that really didn't. So I'm sure that they clearly got that I had not a clue what they were talking about, but I knew they were brilliant and they were doing all of the things that they should do. And they were also quite good at answering my stupid questions. So that's just like one example. And then just how it is that you care for and feed animals that are in the water, a whole different thing. And then the other thing that I certainly didn't realize, and I think a lot of people don't, because sadly, people still don't always think that fish are animals. Mm-hmm. Which is just wrong. Fish are animals. And they certainly don't know much about them. I had and at first, I actually, while I was there, I got certified in scuba diving because it just, it sucks you in, right? That whole world. And as I'm trying to learn how to identify fish. So did you know that many species of fish are one shape when they're kids and one color when they're kids, and then that changes as they get older?
I did not know that.
Yep. And so nor did I. And so at first I was, diving and first snorkeling and then diving and going, oh, okay, so got it. You need to understand, it's like bird watching, right? No, it's much harder than bird watching because they change as they get older. So it's really tough. When I started there also was an increasing focus on aquariums and on aquatic animal welfare, because of the fact that broadly fish were not considered as much animals. They didn't get as much attention, and that was really wrong. And so as I was there, it was clear that there was a sea change, if you will, where that was really changing. And people started demonstrating that you can actually train these aquatic creatures, whether they're invertebrates, whether they're turtles, whether they are a fish. And so the sea started doing that. And so they started training individual animals and demonstrating that, in fact, fish, aquatic creatures really could do this. And so that's really cool. And then also from what we call environmental enrichment, which is really just about making the habitat you're providing for the animal as much like their natural environment as it can be from a behavioral perspective. So not just how it looks, but how it actually functions for the animal and how it makes their life interesting. And so that, other than aquariums, have really been about how they looked and not so much about is it actually enriching the life of an animal? And that has really changed. So all of those things that, zoos have been doing for a while started being applied to the aquatic world. Now, there were many things that the aquatic world was much more sophisticated in than the terrestrial world, but they sort of all came together. And they already were very sophisticated on the veterinary side of things because they had to be. And so that really, really fascinating. I loved that work.
Oh, yeah. It's so interesting. Again, the behind the scenes just being so interesting for that pavilion. I mean, I have not done it, but I would love to. I know they offer where you can kind of go diving. I mean, I'm not a scuba diver, but just, see that behind the scenes. It looks incredible. Well, I have a few more overall questions to ask you before we finish. So I know you've referenced it a bunch of times, but you worked closely with the Association of Zoos and Aquariums throughout your career with the AZA. What's it been like for you to be a part of that organization? Kind of what's your experience been like there?
I am a huge proponent and supporter of the Association of Zoos and Aquariums. I always have been. I think it kind of goes back to the fact that I actually like people and how people work together. And it's always been really clear to me that the AZA, Association of Zoos and Aquariums, which is it's really the accrediting body for primarily North American zoos and aquariums, but also many others scattered around the world. It has so much potential to impact the animal and conservation world because every accredited zoo or zoo or aquarium has guests. So I've always seen that potential a bit, but we need to do it better. And really, every conservation organization that we work with would kill to have those people coming to their place. I don't think they want to do all the work that it takes, but they would kill to have that opportunity. Yeah. So I've always loved that. And I worked with AZA starting from the very beginning. On the very beginning, I worked on the AZA has and the other the other regional zoo and aquarium organizations all manage many species cooperatively. And so you can think of it as, and I'm sure you know about this, but you can think about it as a dating game. That if you're thinking about gorillas as an example, which I generally do, there is a group of people that makes decisions about gorillas based on in terms of how they should be, who they should be living with, who they should be having babies with, all of that, based on a whole lot of genetic information, so that we have the most genetically diverse population that we can, because that's good for a gazillion reasons, and also from a behavioral perspective, is this actually going to work? And from an expertise perspective, and so, like as an example, if you were moving a female that has a long history of having babies and they're hoping that that's going to continue, then it's good to have a group of people that has dealt with youngsters before, especially if there's a problem with maternal care. So they have all of that, and I love that. I also love the work that they do from a training perspective. I was on the board of AZA. I was the chair of the board for a year. And when I was a chair of the board, we put in place a leadership program to train people that were on the executive leadership track and were really thought to be ready within 5 years to run a zoo or aquarium. And so we put a program in place to help them, and nothing like that existed before. So I love all of that stuff. And then, of course, the education piece and inspirational piece, we're really starting to use more terms like engagement rather than and learning and engagement instead of education. Just sounds so boring to people, which is a shame, because I bet you don't find education boring. I don't, but a lot of people do. So, and watching the education departments move into being operations that really focus on engaging people in a serious way and do it very thoughtfully and very professionally. And to also then realizing that they need to be thinking not just about what they're teaching people about animal facts, but that they're really reaching them emotionally, and that they're really creating empathy in that person for the animals. And that they're also really beginning now to think of, actually, they are thinking about what behaviors they really change in the people that visit zoos and aquariums. And I love that part. And then finally, I really could go on about AZA. I'm so sorry.
It's okay.
Again, when I was on the board, we put in place a program called SAFE, which is Saving Animals from Extinction. And that program is really about, we have some members within AZA that do incredible conservation work. So all the New York zoos are part, like the Bronx Zoo, they're all part, and the New York Aquarium, they're all part of the Wildlife Conservation Society, that is one of the largest conservation organizations in the world. So we have some members that are doing phenomenal work, others that are doing a lot of work, and then we have a bunch that are doing stuff, but they're just starting out. And many of them are really small. So SAFE is about helping the members of AZA really do more and better conservation. And so it's about working within the community to establish safe programs that then can actually be things that zoos and aquariums can sign up for. And generally, if they have that species, I don't think they have to, but they have that species, and then be part of conservation in a meaningful way where their teams can get directly involved, that sort of thing, but without having to have the infrastructure of a whole conservation department. So those are just some of the things that I really love about the AZ.
Well, excellent. Well, that leads well into a question I have, which this is such a giant question. I don't expect you to give me a large, long-term monologue, but What's like a big change you've seen with animal care or with conservation? You think, whether it's in recent years or something that might be going on now that's going to happen that is like a really positive thing in terms of how, with the zoo or aquarium or somewhere where animal care or even conservation is really improving?
So I think that the zoological world in general, and this is international, not just within the AZA, is focused more on animal welfare than I've ever seen, and I think that's really important. People have always cared deeply about the animals under their care, but the focus on really thinking about every aspect of their being is a little new. And so that is really exciting to see how people aren't just embracing that, they're doing it. And every organization now has to measure the welfare of their animals. It's pretty cool. So that's one thing. From a conservation side, I think the biggest thing is, not only the SAFE program, but we have realized that it is one thing to develop a protected area, what a national park in another country is, if you will. But if you're really focused on the conservation of that land and the animals on that land, just calling it a park is not very meaningful. And often around the world, there are a lot of what are fondly referred to now as paper parks. And even if it's a good park and they're really doing everything they can, it is not easy to do, and it doesn't always work because of things like poaching and such. And so what people are now realizing is that, and this is actually true not just for conservation, and zoos and aquariums are really realizing this in a very broad way, and I think people are, that conservation has to be community-based. It cannot be. So historically, zoos and aquariums have sadly been quite colonial, just as people in the United States have been quite colonial. And so we have a history of going into other countries and telling them how to do what they need and what they need to do and how to do it according to the way that we would do it, but without really engaging them in the effort. And lo and behold, that doesn't work so well. Isn't that shocking? And I know it's like, how did we ever think that would? But there you go. And it doesn't. And so now the really effective conservation work is being done in a community-based way. And so one of my favorite examples, and it's a local Northwest example, is out of the Woodland Park Zoo. A woman named Dr. Lisa Daybeck has been working with tree kangaroos for decades in Papua New Guinea. And so she started out really focused on the tree kangaroo. And so she went over to do research on them. And that grew to her realization that in order to be effective, she actually needed to work with the community. And now she's so well established in these communities that they actually have set up protected areas. And they're now their protected areas, and they're the communities. And you see examples of that all over the world. So I'm really excited about that part. And I'm also just excited about just anti-colonialism in general and how more effective that makes us at everything. It's just hard.
Oh, definitely. Yeah. I mean, there's, I'm glad to see all the progress we've seen on that front. Well, it's zoos, but around the world for sure. One last question. So I know there are listeners who are interested, whether it's at Disney or San Diego Zoo or aquariums, zoos, wherever, in getting involved in this field in some way. So I'd love to know if you have any advice or any wisdom to impart that might somewhat, something people should look into or consider, or just the type of work they might want to do.
So I talked about, how I tried when I was in high school to figure out how to get into this field and was, other than being a veterinarian, was unsuccessful. And I then learned in college, and particularly after college, as I was looking at graduate schools and such, how many varied careers there were. You can be a park ranger and be actively involved with animals and conservation. You can be a wildlife biologist that works either in a nature center down the road or for the Yosemite National Park, for the Katmai, Alaska area where grizzly bears congregate together every year. You can do wildlife biology on all of these species, and usually as part of the local, state, regional, national governments. So there are all those opportunities. And then the other piece that I think is really important, especially if people. So I thought I was old at 26, and no, I wasn't actually. But there are a lot of people that have been in a career for a long time, and like 20, 30 years, and all of a sudden realize that they really want to work for a conservation organization. And then I meet with them and tell them kind of what it means, and that if they're going to do that, they're going to make a lot less money to begin, unless they're at the executive director level. But what does work is the idea of doing the profession that you love to do and have expertise in within the environment of a zoo or aquarium or conservation organization. So I saw as an example a woman that was in finance within Disney that loved the animal piece and really thought hard about if she could start over, and decided that instead just to focus on being in finance within the conservation world. And I think that's a great thing to do. But there are, for people that are just starting out, one thing that they can do is that AZA now has a student membership. So that's a great way of beginning to learn about it. You can also go to conferences on a reduced rate. If people are interested in animal care, there is an association of zookeepers, AZAC, AA. And so they also have student rates, and a number of students do join them. So that's one thing. The other thing that they can do is to just go in now and search for careers in animal conservation, and they will be shocked and amazed by what comes out. So there's so many things. If you want to study endocrinology, you can work in a zoo, because zoos do endocrinology on a daily basis, and certainly conservationists do as well. So it's just amazing what opportunities are out there. And so people should not feel hindered.
There's just so many good options out there, like you said, and it's great to hear that a lot of different things someone could do. Well, Jackie, this has been so great. I really appreciate the time, and it's been great to hear. Thank you so much for being on the podcast and talking about your career at Disney and then the world of conservation and what's going on with animal behavior.
It was so much fun. And thank you so much for having me. Really great conversation. And I would love to talk with you more about this. So really cool. Thank you for having me.
Well, that was great. I should add one more tidbit. If you're a big fan of Flight of Passage, and in the pre-show, we meet Dr. Jackie Ogden from the Pandora Conservation Initiative, it is not a coincidence that my guest on this show has the same name, because that fictional Dr. Ogden is a tribute. This came from D23 to the real-life Dr. Jackie Ogden, who played such a big role in so many efforts at Disney's Animal Kingdom and beyond. So a fun tidbit about this episode's guest to show the impact that she's had on the parks. I have done some other shows that I've really enjoyed focusing on Disney's Animal Kingdom this year as the park is celebrating its 25th anniversary, including Rick Burunji and Tom Z, both who were closely involved in that opening team. You can find those and a lot more by going to tomorrowsociety.com/podcast with an S at the end, or just check out any of your usual podcast listening apps. Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Overcast, wherever you listen, all the episodes are there, so you can check out all the past episodes of the show. I want to give a big shout out to Richard Hebel, who was my latest new member of the Tomorrow Society through Patreon. I know Richard has been a long-time listener of the show, and I really appreciate all the support beyond just now on Patreon, but throughout the run of the show. It's been awesome. Thank you so much, Richard. If you would like to learn more about becoming a member of the Tomorrow Society through Patreon, it really helps to support the show. You get access to some super cool perks like bonus podcasts and other fun surprises. You can go to patreon.com/Tomorrow Society to learn more. If you'd like to get a hold of me, I love getting emails from you, dan@tomorrowsociety.com. Send me a note. Let me know what you're thinking of the show and if you have any thoughts about future episodes. You can also follow me on all the social media at Tomorrow Society or on Twitter at TomorrowSOC. The music that you are hearing right now was written by Adam Hookey and performed by the Sophisticated Babies. Thank you so much for listening to this episode with Jackie Ogden. and I will talk to you again very soon.